Go. All right. So, um, first and foremost, I'd like to introduce our lovely panelists to you all here today. So, first, David Zachariah is a researcher in Marxist political economy and co-author of How Labor Powers the Global Economy, a Liberal Theory of Capitalism. Jessamyn West is a library technologist in Orange County, Vermont. She is a nationally known speaker, writer, and educator on the issues facing today's libraries. She is the author of the book Without a Net, Librarians Bridging the Digital Divide. She has taught tools for community advocacy for the University of Hawaii's library school and currently works for the Flickr Foundation as a community manager for Flickr Commons. She's been teaching real people to use technology via the public library system in the US since the 90s. You can find her blog focusing on libraries and politics at librarian.net. And Eric, if you could post that link to the chat, that'd be good. And then Alejandro Ruiz has been writing software for 15 years. He's worked on research and development in domains including warehouse logistics, robotics, and search engines. He co-founded Interstitial Technology PVC, a worker co-op that does engineering consulting. He mostly focuses on helping NGOs and other mission-driven organizations with their technical needs. You can find Alejandro's writings about technology at theluddite.org. And lastly, we have Tomas Härdin. He is an MSc in computer science and an electronics engineer. He writes extensively about economic planning and other such things on his blog, and he makes videos about economic planning on his YouTube channel, and you can find those at the links in the chat as well. I want to thank everyone for being here today, and I especially want to extend my thanks to our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today to explore these topics with us. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So the first question is, and again, y'all can answer this in any order that you choose. So introduce yourselves to the audience and give a brief overview of your past and current work. What key takeaways do you hope others can learn from what you've built and thought deeply about? And I guess let's start out with Alejandro and Jessamyn, then we'll go to David and Tomas.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alejandro. You already heard my intro. So I spent most of my software writing career doing R&D for mostly big companies. But in the last 4 or 5 years, I've tried to switch to work with sort of like more mission-driven organizations, NGOs, people in human rights, that sort of thing. And I would say that the single big thing that I've personally had to learn was that I've had a lot less opportunity to work on really big, interesting projects. And I've had to work a lot more on sort of like the nuts and bolts of how organizations move data around, how software intermediates between relationships and organizations. And the thing I really think people ought to take away from that is making software, the vast majority, even, it's easy to focus on or it's more interesting, it's more fun to focus on the big things, and those are important and we should think about them. But most software exists sort of in combination with technical institutional practice, and software, making the software and making the organizations, those have to happen together and they have to evolve together. And that's really the perspective I hope to bring here today.
And I'm Jessamyn West, and I live in the same small town in central Vermont. And I went to library school in the 90s, and I grew up with technology. I'm like second generation technologist. So for me, computers were not only normal, but like video games, right? They're fun, but also they can help you solve problems. And so when I was in library school and afterwards, I worked for like an internet service provider, helping people get DSL. And I worked in the public library system, helping people learn kind of intro to computers. And I always thought the plan was going to be, you teach everybody how to use computers and everybody gets an email address, and then you can go to like second level or higher level learning about technology, like learning about privacy, learning about protecting yourself from scams, being a creator within the space, not just a consumer. And I was like, it'll happen soon, our glorious future. And then what wound up happening was there were always new people who needed to learn technology, which meant we never got at some level to the sort of second order or next order learning how to build it ourselves, learning how to get to sort of that second level sort of sophistication happening. And the other thing that I really found happening was there were always going to be people that need help, right? That even if you taught people how to do a thing or how to make a strategy or how to whatever, just like everything else in the society, there's always going to be people who need help. And working within the public library system, which is sort of where I wound up, like doing community management for Flickr is like a bigger thing. But day-to-day helping people with technology, I've had people coming into my technology classes for like, 15, 20 years. And some of them are kind of never going to get to a level above where they are, right? They're always going to need a person anytime Gmail redesigns to help them find all the buttons again. And so any plan, and this is my message and sort of what I bring forward and what I bring to the table, any plan is going to have to take those people into account. Like I solve problems with technology every minute of my life and I love it. It's amazing. But that doesn't always solve a problem for the people, who are below average in technology and who maybe aren't going to be able to train up to a level that's above average. We need to have a plan that includes those people while we're doing all the other great stuff that technology can do.
All right, thank you so much. And now for David.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me. My past work, well, I've done some work on studying the dynamics of capitalism, understanding capitalism and its class structure through the lens of labor content. I used to teach an evening class in class analysis, so that's a bit of my background in terms of related to this project. Now, as a side project, I've been quite interested in the sort of political economy of planning and especially trying to build on combining the political economy and its sort of understanding of institutional design and so on with principles from systems and control engineering. So there are aspects there. I think there are important principles that you can bring in to aid the design of institutions. And in terms of takeaway, I think what I've come to realize over the last years, maybe working with this, that we have underappreciated the constraints of political feasibility of planning. We have all the planning proposals since the 80s are very much concerned with economic feasibility, trying to demonstrate that in principle it's possible. But I think we have to move beyond this sort of intellectual refutation. We have to come up with principles of robust institutional design that go beyond just saying that planning is feasible, or possible. It's stable. So you have to actually come up with principles that are self-sustaining, that people are willing to take risks for such institutional transitions, that they're willing to support it. And I think this is a much harder problem than this sort of more utopian style writing that we have maybe got accustomed to. Like, the positive examples are half-earth socialism and towards a new socialism. So they're the good examples of opening up your political imagination. But I think it's time to push beyond those limits.
All right, thank you so much. And now for Tomas.
Yes. So my name is Tomas Härdin, and I work with space stuff. Or I have worked with space stuff, I should say. And I mostly now work with video and simulation. And as Leon mentioned, I write a lot about planning. I have been writing about the computational technical stuff. So that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's basically done. And lately I've been looking at accounting. And I work a lot with Dave, so of course I agree with what Dave says. There's a lot of the political aspect of this stuff is something we're going to have to work more with. I also very much would like to get some kind of pilot project off the ground somehow, which is partly why I've been looking at accounting recently. So we have to involve users somehow, so real people. Yeah.
And do you have like any key takeaways that people can that you'd like to people to derive from your work?
Good question. So I've been looking at, like, because I work with, in my simulation work, I work with actual high performance computing stuff. So I have I would say a decent grasp on that kind of thing. So the technical side of it. So you know, you get like the Austrian critique, for example. They claim you can't do the necessary computations, and you just kind of look at it and go, well, yes, we can. But since I've basically figured out that, okay, that's possible, I'm now, you know, I'm moving towards this direction of, well, how do you get people, like everyone, to get their hands on this kind of system? You have to make them usable by like normal people, and that's always a tricky problem. You have to you know, have back and forth, and that's a lot in computer engineering, when you have users and you kind of have to let the users test your thing, and then you know, you fiddle it with it a little bit and you have them test it again. So that's very familiar ground for me.
All right, thanks so much, everyone, for that. There's a lot of agreement on the panel, and from a lot of different diverse perspectives I see. So this will bring me to the next question. And Eric, if you could post this one in the chat, because it's a bit of a longer one, so that everyone can follow along. So this is like the main thing that I want to get to for this is like the main event that I'd like to get to in this panel, which is, so it's relatively easy to imagine utopias that produce what we imagine to be socially desired outcomes. Writers, visionaries, and revolutionaries have imagined such worlds for millennia. However, it's a different thing entirely, as you've all intimated so far, to actually realize such a world. How do we get there is the question of our age. Thus, I want to pitch this question to the panel. What is to be done? How do we build a real utopia? Now, I realize this question is impossibly broad for our allotted time, so I'll zoom into 3 specific aspects of this inquiry. First, do you foresee technological or infrastructural roadblocks that have yet to be overcome before we can realize post-capitalist information systems? Second, how can people and organizations utilize your work in the here and now to build post-capitalist outcomes? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how do we face the challenge of incorporating the human elements of technology and social change in bringing about democratic economic planning systems? All right, and I guess we'll stick with the order that we had last time. So Alejandro and Jessamyn, take it away.
All right. I have one point that is something I think about often in my practice that is, I think, answers sort of the vibe of all 3 of them combined, just as much as maybe any of them in particular, which is, this is something I run into a lot. You know, most software in the world has been written under capitalism, and that's the reality of my practice and the reality of most people's practices. And for me, one thing I've learned is when I work with stakeholders, they tend to be higher up in an organization, right? So I'm a contractor, they hire me, whatever. And there's one thing that software really has a tendency to do that worries me in creating like a democratic society that's heavily dependent on computerization, is its tendency to freeze social relations, right? So when you write software, you know, you have all these discussions and you decide what information flow should look like, et cetera. But eventually that like turns into code, and code is, you know, code is interpreted by a computer. It's very inflexible. And then that has a tendency to downstream affect behavior on the other end. And this is, you know, true of all sort of like computer systems. It's true in small and big examples. Like, for example, you know, in order to be able to in order to like make the thing you're doing accountable, right? Like expense reports need to be written, et cetera. And, you know, you can do this, you can see this kind of change in small situations like accounting, where it maybe is desirable and good, but also in like, you know, really large situations as big as like online dating, right? Where like suddenly we have all these concepts like ghosting that like didn't exist until these platforms came in. So this is something that I really struggle with in my practice, and something that I hope other people on the panel can talk about, which is or maybe we can talk about a bit, which is I don't really have a theory yet for the role of like democratic input and software and sort of like this tension in our post-capitalist world.
Right along those lines, actually, like Ali and I got together and talked about some of this, like, last night over beers. But like one of the things that I often think about the roadblock to sort of post-capitalism is post-capitalism, like democratic economic process, is that not only have our software been created under capitalism, but our institutions have kind of made decisions about what the outlines of our social interaction over software should look like. And so to back up like briefly, in addition to being community manager for the Flickr Foundation, I've run this online community Metafilter, which you may or may not have heard of, for like the last 20 some odd years. It's like an old creaky online community. It's all text, so it's easy to do certain things. But one of the things we pay attention to as like sort of community managers, community moderators, is software can only do so much, right? That software can sort of give you affordances for what you're allowed to do, as sort of you said, but it can also, when you're determining what something should look like, almost by definition, that has to include what it doesn't look like, right? Like what's not allowed, what isn't an affordance that's built in. And there's a certain extent to which you can have democratic input on that. And then there's a certain extent to which somebody really ultimately has to be the person that makes the decision and says, ship it, right? And so one of the things that we've found is that you can create some outlines of whatever community behavior or community outcome is that you want, right? Because ultimately it's community if people are using software, whether or not there's like community tools built into it, you have a community of users that you can be answerable to or less answerable to. And so part of what we found is that the software does certain things and then it disallows certain things, like dumb example, but like you can't post images to Metafilter. We just don't, you can't, the software doesn't do it. Tough. But then there's a lot of community shaping around those things. So there's certain things that are allowed, certain things that are disallowed, but then in between there are sort of the soft skill things that the humans add to the software, which is what is incented, what behavior is encouraged, and what behavior is not encouraged. And so when I think about sort of a technological look at a way, and this is also question number 2, like my work, right? But when I think of a technological look at sort of a future where we do more economic stuff together using technology, part of it has to be the hard stuff. I mean, meaning like built into the software. You can do this, you can't do this, the yes, the no, which ultimately is all you have. And then there's the incented stuff, which there probably has to be human involvement with. And like, there's nothing wrong with human involvement. I think we need to plan for it. But the tricky thing is human involvement is expensive and it is also enduring, meaning that you need to have a plan for what that's going to look like moving forward. Whereas if you're building an app, it's like, it's the app, we shipped it, we're done with the app until the API designs or something about that is part of sort of the work that I bring to it, those sort of weird, soft community aspects in between the yeses and the nos that software lets you do.
All right. Am I next? So, all right. So you have 3 questions here. Roadblocks. Well, there's a lot of roadblocks. Many of them are legal, but I mean, in terms of the specific technologies, I think I'll defer this to Tomas, who has much more expertise. In the short sense, I think if you set aside the legal aspects, at least the type of techniques that Tomas and I have been discussing, they're all realizable within the existing technology. In that sense, there are no roadblocks on that track, but there are a lot of other institutional ones that are there. But I won't discuss that thing in further detail now. Let me just think about the second question, namely how people could use our work. So we've done some initial work where we're using actual supply and use tables for balancing the economy, for instance, based on targeted final demand. What would be the allocation of work across workplaces, at least in principle? How would you rebalance things in the economy? So our current work, as it is at least available now, could actually be used by people who are facing, economies that are facing, real challenges in supply chain or real economic constraints. How this should be interfaced with people or organizers, that in my view is one of the big challenges we face, in that a lot of these techniques are meant to address the problems that people on the end of union organizing face, both as workers able to address the situation, but also in terms of their material well-being being affected by the outcomes of planning. So it depends. This depends a lot on the institutional context in different countries. So countries like Scandinavia, where I am at, there you have huge trade organizations trade union organizations that have economists that you can actually talk to, and interfacing with these kind of people are at least one level of where our work can actually have some impact, because it makes them realize what is potentially possible in real terms rather than in monetary terms or the conventional framework that they're operating in. I've given the talk once to such people, and they come up afterwards and realizing that it opens the horizon at least to much more possibilities once you start thinking in these terms. So my hope is to push our work more in that direction over time, so we can reach organizers and people in the trade union organization. But it'll be initially obviously a small section of these groups. Our challenge is to convince them that this can address their immediate problems. We can't just pose this as an academic project where this will realize some high goal or whatever. It has to show that these are the concrete problems you face, and this is how we tackle them. And it's not like we lack such. Housing, inflation. There's so many aspects of present day life that we can actually show a different allocation and control could actually change things. So yeah, that's how I think it could widen horizons, show that new tools are available. That's how I think our work could be used. And the way I see it is actually it's part of an ongoing debate, right? Or discussion, try to refine these models and come up with experimentation and so on over time. That remains to be seen how far we can go. The third point was incorporating human elements of technology. You probably know most of the audience may know there's a past work on this. Neurath had to consider this issue of how do you communicate to a mass audience that is, or a mass of people who are very much illiterate. So, and in this sense, technology, most people are not maybe literate in these things, and you have to create an interface with how you present economic options through technology. And there's a lot of work to be done there. I have not done much. I've thought a lot about it, how to simplify things and make it concrete. I think one important thing to think about is how do you make, one fundamental problem, I think, is how do you make economic trade-offs clear and transparent for common person and decision makers. I think this is a huge problem. It's a huge intellectual challenge to come up with this, because, and this is actually von Mises' critique, that if we don't come up with some sort of simplifying mechanism, then there will be a bewildering number of economic options. There's just no chance human beings can make rational decisions on all possible economic options. And of course, one answer from the socialist left has been to use, among other metrics, labor time. But this is part of this ongoing discussion. How to communicate economic trade-offs, I think, are key. Yeah, that's about it.
Should I talk?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks so much, David. Now for Tomas, you can come in and respond to that very large prompt that I kind of lumped into one big question.
Yeah. So on the technical side, obviously we need software, but the software depends on the user, as always. But I can just mention like some of the stuff I've been looking at. Like we need some kind of cloud thing that people can interact with, that we can collect data into, compute statistics, and coordinate things. and computing like potential paths forward, like for example the environment. Like we have to, we will need computational help to figure out how to deal with the environment, because there are hundreds of different production methods, and like which one should we invest in? That's a very tricky question, and it's not really being handled at the moment. There's like nothing about that, and especially how they fit together. Like forestry can be used for sequestration, and then combined with a what is it, BEX kind of thing. That's an entire thing unto itself. And I reckon that this is fully possible with existing hardware. I think Dave mentioned this as well. I've done some calculation on it. Like if we, at least in the medium term, if we guesstimate that we have 1 million workplaces involved in this thing, that seems doable. Whether this can scale up to the level of individuals, every single individual, I don't know yet. But definitely on the order of 1 million workplaces, that seems reasonable. I saw the good question here in the comments on like how to make these relations visible to like regular people. And especially, like as Dave also pointed out, like there are so many variables on this that no one can ever oversee the entire thing. That's like literally impossible. A person can really only keep 7 things in their head at the same time. But we can provide a local view of any problem. So we can try and perhaps present to users maybe 3 metrics on anything, and like they can maybe use their own little judgment. But we have to realize that there's a limit to human bandwidth. So I think we can write software that makes this a lot easier, but it's of course not trivial. It will require a lot of interaction with users, a lot of experimentation. And human element, of course, that's the same thing. Kind of the human element or organizational element, they fit together. We need contact with the unions. We need some kind of control over some means of production to actually be able to test these things. We cannot be purely it can make some progress with like role play, but I think the best thing would be have some kind of non-trivial means of production. Yeah.
All right, and is that all you have to say on that question?
I think so. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Before we move on to the next section, I want to give every panelist a chance to respond to anything that the other panelists have brought up. So if there's anything that you want to yes and, in that sense, then by all means. And then after that, we will move on to the audience questionnaire.
I have a thought. I have a sort of complementary thought to something Tomas just said. That I fully agree with you on the like limits, like the fire hosing users with complexity is like a really bad way to design a thing that for them to understand. But I think there's like a complementary limit, maybe on the other side of the spectrum, which is like on the one hand, there's the limits of what people can handle in terms of like UX design and inputs and stuff. But then on the other hand, there's sort of the limits to what like computers can understand and formalize in like a strict sense. And I think because so much of the interest in democratic economic planning is, because of like the environmental ecological collapse, that's like a period where that's a point where it's particularly difficult, I think, I think computers do have an important role in calculating some things, but I think even in our current, half-hearted, broken on purpose attempts to deal with climate change, you can see a sum of these pathologies already coming out, right? Like as soon as we as soon as we tried to switch to, as soon as we tried to do like a sort of market legible solution to climate change in terms of like carbon accounting, we quickly like started reorganizing our behavior around that, which is like the concern I tried to come up with earlier. So I think there's sort of like this spectrum of like the limits of humans and the limits of computers, and it's another challenge I see where I don't really know quite how to navigate it sometimes.
One of the other things I was thinking about too. Oh, sorry. Go on, Thomas.
I just quickly point out that yes, of course, computers are just a tool. So we should be careful not to sort of fetishize them. Yeah.
Well, and the thing I was going to mention, just again, sort of agreeing with Tomas, is that this whole idea that you need sort of cloud platforms and solutions, I think is both essentially correct and also brings up another weird little wrinkle. And I mean, I could talk roadblocks all day, right? But a small roadblock, which is you need to get a platform that people trust and feel okay about. And I think just online culture as it is now, which I think would be your early adopters for sort of anything that you start with, are really sort of deep into hypercriticality about the tools that they use, while at the same time not understanding that really you have to pick one at the end of the day. Sort of it's like that American democracy problem, right? Like, yes, neither of those people is the person I would want if I were designing the person, but if I need to pick a person, I can pick a person. And so thinking about, right now, thinking about how you interact with the existing clouds and how people pick the ones that they want, thinking about trust and engendering trust within communities such that people can feel at least not awful, if not good about their choices. I think we need to get people used to the idea that if you want to move forward with sort of the future that you're really hoping for around climate change or around democratic ideals of what we're looking for, you have to make a small series of pick one choices. This is kind of the William Blake genuine option idea, where you need to find a choice that is compelling. You need to find a choice that is sort of, and you need to find a choice that people can choices, as Tomas said. We need to think about what's going to make them trust the systems enough that they'll make a choice, because what we need in order to move forward is for people to start making choices, not waiting until their perfect option comes along.
Oh yeah, I agree. Me and Dave have been making the point that it's very important to have open data in this kind of system, and that's one way to generate trust. Like anyone can see what you're doing, and that also means that like we can't put everything into this kind of system. Obviously, like people's personal purchasing habits probably doesn't belong in there. But if you're requisitioning, I don't know, tools or whatever, chemicals from the system, or you're saying that you're gonna log a certain area or whatever, then you know that someone might look at your stuff and like you're requesting resources, but you're wasting them, for example. That's a simple thing we could like compute and display in a way that, we could just have a smiley face or a frowny face. That could be like a red or green or whatever. But just have a thing where you can show like, okay, this person is doing kind of the same thing that everyone else is doing, or this workplace, let's say, is doing kind of the same thing as everyone else in that industry. So there's a lot I think we can do that is very human friendly, let's say.
And doesn't rely on lurkers support me in email like arguments, that we can actually look at how people feel about the system sort of individually, and we don't have to kind of get vibes from the loudest or the richest or whoever's like getting the most attention. We can actually figure out how people feel about it, and then at some point reach a decision point, which is also important, right? People need to be somebody needs to be like, okay, decision point, whatever that means, right? We've been asking for people's opinions for this amount of time, decision point, move forward. We just did a local logging operation. So your example was very prescient in trying to get community feedback on the logging operation, which we were probably as the town going to do anyhow. It's tricky, right? Trying to figure out how to get feedback, but not so much feedback that you could never do the thing.
All very salient. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
I was just going to mention, so I want to move on to the audience questionnaire real soon. So if you have any last points, feel free to wrap that up. If David, if you want to hop in and respond to or yes in anything that they've been talking about, then by all means. Otherwise, let's try and in the next 5 minutes wrap up this thread of discussion. Then we'll head on to the audience questionnaire.
Sure, I have nothing to add.
Okay, I can add something just quickly. Since I live in northern Sweden, forestry is very important. It's a very important part of our economy. So I think about that stuff a lot. It's also a very slow industry, and this is also where planning is very important, since the production period for wood is like 100 years. That needs a bit of deliberation, and you kind of have to. There's a lot of smallholder forestry people up here in northern Sweden, but there's also like 2 or 3 really big logging companies that everyone hates. So, and they own like half the country. So, yeah.
All right. Any last remarks from our panelists? Going once, going twice, and gone. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording now and we'll head on to the audience Q&A, and I will hopefully this recording saves on my computer. I'll let y'all know how that goes, I guess. All right. Thanks once again for entering those questions and for that discussion. And yeah, that's it for the recording.